Hello, I'm Jeff Birchfield. Thanks for joining me for another episode of Quantum. Can you imagine facing the day without a morning cup of tea or coffee? For millions of people, it's the only way they can get started. Caffeine is the most popular poison on the planet, and yet it's considered harmless. Tonight's program asks, how did the world get hooked on caffeine? And does it stimulate more than your mind? You know the feeling. Head's pounding, anxiety is setting in. Can't decide, can't concentrate. I need my hit. Then I catch the aroma. Satisfaction is close. With that first mouthful, I can take on the day.
What is it about coffee that's created these temples to its consumption? Well, few of us would admit it, but we're actually lured here by a drug, caffeine. So what is the big attraction?
This is where the taste begins. Wild coffee trees survive in the forests of equatorial Africa. But as a crop, it has become the world's most valuable traded commodity after oil. The reason for its popularity is quite simply the caffeine it contains. Caffeine is marvellous stuff for giving you a lift. But what about all those other stories? How addictive is it? Why does it make your heart race? Should you drink it if you're pregnant? And can it really help you concentrate, or is that just a myth? There are other, more obvious drugs competing for our attention. Public concern keeps them in the spotlight. But we shouldn't underestimate caffeine. It's a surprisingly powerful drug in its own right.
Caffeine is a drug in the sense that it has pharmacological effects in the body and it has properties similar to other substances that we generally refer to as drugs, things like nicotine, alcohol and even hard drugs.
Although coffee accounts for just over half the caffeine we consume, it comes in many other forms too.
Tea and chocolate contain a significant amount. Many people also know that cola drinks can pack a big caffeine punch. The amount of caffeine in these foods varies considerably, and how they're prepared alters the level again. What all this means is that the world is seriously hooked on caffeine, to the tune of 120,000 tonnes of it per annum.
Coffee first thing in the morning, a coffee on the train to work and a coffee as soon as I get to work. I have quite a few in the morning just to get me going.
If you drink too many, you reach a point that's, you know you drank too many. But it's not an incremental thing. It's bang, you're either on or you're off. It's a feeling of, I'm a bit too wired now.
So, as drugs go, caffeine is remarkably potent stuff. Question is, how exactly does it deliver its hit from inside your body? Let's take a look. Caffeine is absorbed by the body very quickly, reaching peak levels within an hour. It makes everything speed up. It increases urine production, dilates blood vessels, opens airways to the lungs, strengthens muscles, and stimulates the cortex of the brain. How caffeine manages to do all this, no one's quite sure, but it appears to release the molecular handbrake that regulates how often our nerves fire. It does this by competing with a substance called adenosine. Normally, adenosine acts like an amber light, stopping impulses from speeding along the nerves. But if caffeine is around, it hijacks the system and lets the impulses zip through. One of caffeine's most powerful effects is to pump up your blood pressure. Professor Jack James believes this is a serious health hazard, even if you're not hooked on the stuff.
I guess what people tend to think is, well, I suppose the more I use, the more damaging it's going to be. It's not so much a question of if you use less, will you have less of an effect, because that's not the case. Even 1 cup will produce the same increase in blood pressure, broadly speaking, than several cups consumed during the day. The difference is that the increase in blood pressure from 1 cup will be not as long-lasting.
Higher blood pressure is a major contributor to cardiovascular disease in the population.
I think what we would find if we removed caffeine from society would be that there would be a reduction, a modest but nevertheless significant reduction in cardiovascular disease and death.
It's no coincidence that caffeine has a dark side. It's actually a poison created by plants to protect themselves from being eaten. Most animals can't stand the bitter taste. But we've been pursuing it since ancient times. Coffee made its appearance as a hot drink 1,000 years ago in Ethiopia. One story has it that a goat herd named Kaldi saw how his animals pranced about excitedly after nibbling coffee berries. He tried them himself and found they kept him alert while he watched his herd. Tea drinking started in China when the leaves of a kind of camellia bush were boiled. But it took 1,000 years of trial and error to work out how best to pick and dry the choicest leaf tips. Cocoa had suitably colourful origins too. From the forests of the Amazon, it made its way north to the land of the Mayas and Aztecs. When the Spanish conquistadors saw the Aztec emperor drinking it as a foaming chocolate drink, they wanted some too. It was rumoured to be a sexual stimulant. That was enough for one Spanish bishop to threaten with excommunication
anyone who drank chocolate in church. One by one, these caffeine beverages made their way to Europe, where they caused a sensation. By 1660, coffee houses, the first true cafes, had sprung up all over the place. They attracted great thinkers and great idlers alike. King Charles II of England tried to ban them, but public outcry kept them open. As for the effects of coffee on all who drank it, one 19th century chemist saw it like this.
The sufferer is tremulous and loses his self-command. He is subject to fits of agitation and depression. He has a haggard appearance. As with other such agents, a renewed dose of poison gives temporary relief, but at the cost of future misery.
I started to realise that caffeine was a problem when I started to drink 10 to 15 strong, long blacks, probably in a mug, 10 to 15 of those a day. I'd get my little hit off coffee, but then I'd almost like fall off the cliff. And then half an hour later, I'd have to have another coffee.
It is highly addictive in the sense that a large majority of people who consume caffeine regularly will report withdrawal effects if they stop suddenly.
And I didn't actually realise I was addicted, because you just sort of go along and it just happens, you know?
If you're an addict and caffeine has hijacked all your adenosine receptors, beware. The body may retaliate.
But what happens when you consume caffeine regularly is that the number of adenosine receptors in the body increase to compensate for the receptors being occupied by caffeine. So that if a person abstains abruptly from caffeine use, then in effect they have an oversupply of adenosine receptors, and this accounts for the unpleasant effects, the dysphoric effects, the tiredness, the lethargy, the irritability, and the headache, it seems.
The low feeling is addiction, and the hit only feels like a hit. Caffeine is actually just bringing you back up to normal speed.
When I'm down in the dumps, for instance, I actually have noticed it, that I feel better once I had a cup of coffee. You can talk to me then.
Ready?
Yep.
Okay, go.
Of course, what everyone wants to know is whether caffeine really gets you on the ball. Psychologist Paula Mitchell put volunteers through a series of brain teasers.
Caffeine increases alertness. Therefore, you would expect caffeine to be particularly beneficial at times of day when alertness is low. The body has a natural 24-hour rhythm of alertness, which decreases overnight. And therefore, caffeine seems to be particularly beneficial at those times. It brings arousal back up to an optimal level.
So why would you expect that if I'd had coffee, my performance would be even worse than it is?
Basically because caffeine decreases hand steadiness.
Just as well, I'm not a brain surgeon.
That was about a zillion mistakes just
Yeah,
then.
all in one. Okay.
Oh, hang on.
In tests that draw on short-term memory and cool-headed reasoning, caffeine's influence is far more subtle.
Has anyone ever gone insane after doing this test?
Close, very close.
Providing a mental task is relatively easy, you can actually get a better score.
Again?
Yeah. So do you think I'd do better or worse if I'd had a big cup of coffee?
Better.
Really?
Yep, caffeine actually improves performance on this task.
Well, maybe I should have a cup then. Wouldn't go astray at the moment.
But if what you're doing is at all complex, like balancing the accounts, for example, caffeine may let you down.
In a lot of tasks, you measure both speed taken to complete the task and also accuracy. And caffeine certainly improves speed, but perhaps that's at the expense of accuracy.
If caffeine can make our minds race, what effect does it have on our bodies? The International Olympic Committee have set limits on its use by athletes because of the widespread belief that caffeine delivers an explosive boost to muscle power. Pentathlete Alex Watson learnt about this the hard way.
In my sport there's a caffeine test and I failed it in Seoul, and I hence had a pretty rotten Olympic Games and ending in being sent home to Australia. So no, it got me into a lot of trouble.
Alex drank 12 cups of brewed coffee in a day to keep him alert during his fencing tournaments. His urine caffeine levels exceeded the IOC limit.
Their advice was that you could only exceed it if you drank something in the order of 30 to 40 cups of coffee in a day. In other words, a level by which they believed you'd be physically ill before you could actually put that much coffee into your body.
What the test didn't take into account was how different people metabolise caffeine at quite different speeds.
If you're a very slow metaboliser of caffeine, which I obviously am, you can reach that level doing something quite innocent.
Recent experiments have verified that caffeine can actually overcome muscle fatigue. Apparently, it opens up extra calcium channels within the fibres, allowing muscles to stay active longer. You can feel the benefits within an hour. This could be especially valuable in endurance sports.
Hold it. It's time to reveal the scientific secrets that go to make the perfect cup of tea or coffee. And it's got a lot to do with how hot the water is and how long you let it brew. Both drinks are a very complex mix of flavours. In coffee, there are over 100 different aroma molecules, ranging from very bitter to quite sweet. Some of the most fragrant of them are actually quite fragile, so that when the hot water hits the grounds, they're actually boiled off in the steam. That's why coffee often smells better than it tastes. The trick is to leave it brewing just long enough to dissolve out the best flavours from the coffee or tea, but without extracting the bitter residues as well. For coffee, 2 minutes brewed with water just off the boil should give your taste buds a thrill. For tea, 3 to 5 minutes is perfect. Either way, that's plenty of time to get the caffeine in your cup. For people who want tea or coffee without caffeine, well, you can't get rid of it all. But using steam, it is possible to extract 97% of the caffeine molecules.
Oh, Jen, look, there's this shovelhead, one of the rare abnormalities, but yeah, that's a good example of that. But of course,
there have been many claims that caffeine hinders human reproduction. At exceptionally high levels, it will damage chromosomes. But what's of more concern is that even moderate consumption may reduce fertility by damaging sperm.
It looks a little bit. But of course, these guys have been drinking the equivalent of about 15 cups of coffee per day, so...
To date, most of these studies have been performed on laboratory animals only. But researchers like Irina Pollard believe the trend is so clear that fathers-to-be should beware.
In normal semen, you always get a proportion of malfunctioning sperm, abnormal ones, or adverse shapes. But the percentage of these goes up proportional to the amount of caffeine.
Does it surprise you?
Dr. Pollard's advice to any couple planning a family is to cut back on caffeine. Certainly drink less than 4 cups a day.
Doing the ultrasound, a bit cold and wet. It's quite good for your skin.
At Sydney's Royal Hospital for Women, a study is confirming what many pregnant women have long suspected.
Coming through onto the baby's head. Back onto
Caffeine
the baby's
gives
head.
the
You
baby
can see
a
the
kick
outline
as
of
well.
the baby's head. I'll try and see if I can show you the baby's face. Now you can see the lips quite clearly.
Using ultrasound imaging, Dr. Leo Leader has been monitoring the activity of the fetus before and after the mother has had a cup of coffee. The difference is quite dramatic.
We certainly see not only more activity but less periods of rest, and that seems to last about 30 or 40 minutes after a cup of coffee. It reinforces the fact that if mothers drink too much coffee, more than 4 or 5 cups a day, I think it would suggest that those babies are being stimulated all the time and may produce abnormal behaviour in the baby, in that you're not going to get the normal rest activity cycles that babies normally develop. So it may lead to the fact that these babies become a little bit more active than one would like.
With that in mind, it's amazing that a hospital in Perth is feeding caffeine to preterm babies. They've actually found that caffeine can be a lifesaver.
The major problem that preterm babies have that we treat with caffeine is forgetting to breathe. They have apnea and often a slowing of the heart. So they're chugging along and then they just forget to breathe, their heart rate slows and they may go dusky blue as they lose oxygen.
The drug that's traditionally used here is theophylline. Like caffeine, it relaxes the airways, making it easier to breathe. But unlike caffeine, it has some unpleasant side effects. As it turns out, theophylline is just a few atoms removed from caffeine, something our bodies already seem to know.
The major reason we started using it is that the medicine we used to use, theophylline, is actually converted by the baby into caffeine, which has its active effect on the brain. So it seemed much safer to use the drug you want to have the effect rather than give something that has to be converted by the body. The problem with caffeine, it isn't released as a recognised drug, so there's great difficulty. We therefore, 3 or 4 years ago, set about trying to manufacture this, and our hospital pharmacy has now developed this process by skillfully making it either for intravenous use or for oral use. We actually measure the level of caffeine in the blood, and we do that usually once a week to make sure we are reaching adequate levels in the baby's bloodstream, as well as not reaching toxic levels. So we do take it seriously, the fact that we're using a potentially worrying substance. And having a use like this in a very therapeutic way is a challenge to society, but it reflects the seriousness that we give caffeine. It's a drug.
Despite the surge of enthusiasm for specialty coffees, lattes, mochachinos, macchiatos and the like, people are actually turning away from coffee in big numbers. Since 1962, per capita consumption has fallen by more than a third. However, the caffeine industry has grown. In that same time period, the sale of soft drinks containing caffeine has tripled. A lot more people are acquiring a taste for the drug earlier, and that includes kids.
I think you can draw a parallel between the caffeine industry here and its commercial interests and the way in which it acts to protect those interests, and the tobacco industry. We know that the tobacco industry has gone to great lengths to protect its commercial interests, and the caffeine industry is currently engaged in similar practices.
What do we make of a drug that is universally accepted but affects our bodies so profoundly?
For many millions of us, drinking tea or coffee is one of life's great pleasures. Should we ignore the warning bells or somehow rein it in?
There's no evidence to suggest that caffeine does anything good for us of a particularly important kind. There is substantial evidence to suggest that caffeine may be harmful. That, to me, suggests that there's no point consuming it.